guys! So I'm here today to finish up the last of my March reviews, and it's really weird because to me it felt like I was reading barely anything in March, but looking back I think I managed to read like 14 books, which isn't phenomenal for me, but like it's shocking how you think that you're having a terrible reading month and you're getting no reading done, and then you look back and you're like, oh my god, here's this long list of books that I've gotten through. So I just thought it was interesting. So the first book I read was Even This Page is White by Vivek Shraya. This is a poetry collection about what it's like to be brown in a world of white people in this Western society, and talks about social justice issues like gender identity and obviously racism, sexuality, and it discusses these things, I think, relatively well in its poetry. I don't know, I just don't have a lot to say about it. I think it said a lot of things that are really important. I felt like I'd read a lot of those things before and like I'd gotten all those messages already, but that's just because I mean, I'm obviously relatively liberal, and I get a lot of liberal, like, media at me, so to me I might feel kind of oversaturated with the exact same message again and again. For someone who isn't so, oversaturated with these kinds of messages, this could be a really, really valuable kind of poetry collection to look into and to read, because it does give a really good depiction of what it's like to not be white in a world that is white. It wasn't very memorable to me. Like, if I look back, I can think of maybe one or two poems in a collection of, like, 40. So didn't really leave an impression on me, but I would recommend it if you're looking into it, if you want to read this kind of perspective and in the form of poetry, then this is definitely something to check out. I don't have anything to say about it, honestly, other than that. The next book I read was The Butcher's Hook by Janet Ellis, and this is a weird book. This is the perspective of a relatively upper-class girl in, I believe it was the 18th century England. This follows this girl, this upper-class girl, and she gets put in a situation where her parents want her to marry someone that she doesn't want to marry. And from there, she goes about dealing with that situation. So that's really all I want to say without giving a lot away, because this is the kind of book that I think benefits from you going into it and not really know anything about it. It is very twisted in parts, and if you don't necessarily have the stomach for things that are potentially like graphic or violent or upsetting, then I wouldn't recommend reading this because you really wouldn't get along with it. I appreciated it for what it was. I will say that I didn't love it. I felt disconnected from the plot at times, from the story. There were a lot of times where I would just skim it because I'd get bored and I didn't really care that much. Like, I didn't really want to go through the whole slog of like getting through a scene because I thought that the pace was relatively slow, for me at least, and because the book didn't have much to offer me aside from plot and character, if there was a long scene, I wouldn't really get much from it. The length of the scene didn't really add anything to my enjoyment, so I would often just skim things and to get to major plot points. Another thing I thought was really weird was the way that certain characters change throughout the novel. I've talked about this before in another video, but the main character's father is shown to have been a really wonderful father in her childhood, and then he's had some kind of major character shift, so now he's a pretty horrific bad person. And this character shift was very weakly explained, and that took me out of the story. And there were just times where characters would act in certain ways that I thought were unbelievable, or they would say something and it'd be like, it just sounded off. This is another book that left me kind of lukewarm. I think that if the premise of like twisted girl in Victorian society sounds interesting to you, then it is worth checking out. And there are some things that the book does explore, like the fact that she is a woman, and she is a relatively intelligent woman, but she is never given access to the breadth of education that she wants and deserves. And that's interesting, and you have a lot about how just because she is a woman, she's seen as powerless. And a lot of the things in the book that occur are a form of her taking that power back. So there is a lot in this book that's really interesting and worth reading. Yeah, I didn't love it, but I think if you find the premise interesting, there is a lot to get from it. And then the next book I read was a collection of short stories, The Accusations by Bandy. And this is translated by Deborah Smith. So this is a collection of stories where the author is currently living in North Korea. This is the first published work we have in the Western world by someone who is still a resident of North Korea. So these stories were written between 1989 and 1995 and then smuggled out of North Korea in 2013. It's difficult to say how I feel about this because the stories have a message, and the message is very powerful, and the message is about how the North Korean government is affecting the lives of ordinary civilians. And the short story collection, I think, is essentially a bunch of different situations in which the government acts somewhat ridiculously and irrationally and thereby impacts the lives of these citizens in incredibly negative ways. And the message here is that it is impacting the citizens' lives in these negative ways, and the message is the lives of these people. But the message is, I think, in a lot of cases all there is. These aren't the kinds of stories where there's anything really beyond the actual plot and the intention of the story. If that makes sense. So the characters act in a way and the plot acts in a way, that both contribute to the telling of this message, which is, in this particular story, how the government has infected these people's lives. And I don't think that's even a bad thing necessarily, because, I mean, I assume that these stories weren't heavily edited. I assume that these stories aren't really there other than as an outlet for the author to tell his frustrations with the regime. And I think it's worth reading because it is a view of North Korean life by someone who lives in North Korea. And, you know, as someone who, I'm not that educated on North Korea in a grand scheme, but I've read, my knowledge of it honestly just comes from like all the memoirs I read of defectors, because I went on some kind of binge a while ago where I just read defector memoirs for a while. But this was a really interesting kind of extra element into that, because I read a lot of escape stories, but not a lot of stories of people who can't escape. And I think that's really worth reading. And the last book I read was Pachinko by Minji Lee. And this is the story of a Korean girl who immigrates to Japan. And it's a story of her life and the life of her children and her children's children. And this is an incredibly interesting look, I think, into something that I didn't know a lot about, because I had no idea that there was racism within Japan towards Koreans, and much less that this was a major problem. The author's idea for the story came from this real-life story of a Korean boy who was living in a Japanese school, and one day he killed himself. I believe he was 12 years old. And looking through his yearbook, his parents saw that it was littered with messages from Japanese children, things like, "You're Korean, you dirty Korean, go die," etc. And that spurred the author on this project and wanting to write about what it's like to be a Korean living in Japan, because it is difficult, right? Because these are people who, they are second or third generation Koreans living in Japan, and they are as Japanese as anyone else, right? Like, they were born in this country, they were raised with this culture, but they are still Korean to the Japanese. And so Pachinko is about the intricacies of that, and it's the intricacies of identity and family and struggle, and what it's like to work all your life and then find that what you're working for is useless, or what it's like to find that your identity has changed all of a sudden, and what it's like, what identity is. And I'm just rambling now because this book is about a lot of things. It is about the story of a family over a long period of time, and about the bonds in that family, and how people interact and what their lives are like. Like, this is an incredibly character-focused story, so if you like something like Commonwealth by Ann Patchett or Homegoing by Ya Jossi, you might enjoy it, because it is 100% character-focused. It's plot-oriented in the sense that major things will happen in their lives, but the book doesn't really have a sense of this is the conflict. And it's written in a kind of odd style, because there are moments when it's this third-person narrator, right? And so normally it's just following the characters of the family. But then there'll be times when the family interacts with someone else. So let's say a restaurant owner, and then there'll be a brief paragraph where it says something like, the restaurant owner really liked these people, the restaurant owner had a nice wife, it talks a little bit about the restaurant owner and his perspective, and then you go back to the family. You never go back to that character. But it's kind of abrupt, and I've never really seen anything like this before, and I ended up kind of enjoying it. Like, it was abrupt and kind of weird to be in one perspective and just be put in another really quickly and then put back, but I grew to enjoy it, because it just gave me this quick glimpse of someone else. It's hard for me to discuss it, because I feel like all it's left with for me is questions, which is good, and that's what I want books to give me, is a bunch of questions and a lot to think about, and it did give me that. I've heard a lot of people really don't like the abrupt writing style, a lot of people don't like the pace, or they find it boring, so I grew accustomed to the writing style. Like, I grew accustomed to the weird shifts, and I was okay with that. I never found it boring, and I think that's because I'm so much a character-focused reader. If you're kind of similar to me in that, then I think you'll find it engaging. I know that a lot of people haven't, and I think genuinely if you're a plot-based reader, or you sometimes have difficulty with like long, slow books, and because this is a long book, then you might not enjoy it as much, but despite its flaws, I really, really enjoyed it. So that was the last of my March reviews. Tell me if you've read any of these, if you haven't, if you will. As always, thanks for watching, and have a good day.